Welcome, everybody. I was just saying to Leah, the last time I gave a talk, I was pregnant and I had maternity pants on, and I used to have to like put this up here. Anyway, now I don't have to. Happy about that. Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I was just also saying to Leah, oh, what a great crowd, and then I thought, I think a lot of you folks have to be here for your classes. How many people are here on their own accord? Whoa! All are welcome. Thank you so much. Again, my name is Danielle Carr. I am the Sexual Violence Educator for Western. Is this too loud? And a proud faculty member here at Fanshawe. I'm also a graduate of Fanshawe College, and we were just discussing, Lorraine and I, when that was, and it was about 15 years ago. So really happy to be back, and happy to be invited to speak today. Before we go any further, I want to acknowledge that we meet today on Indigenous land, the land belonging to the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe people. And I want to make sure that we're doing these land acknowledgements and moving beyond sort of a presentation checklist. I've been attending presentations and conferences where we've been doing these land acknowledgements, and I'm stoked that that's happening. But I think it's just happening, and I don't think we're connecting it to the work. So I want us to be mindful as we're moving through some of the content today that because it's complex, it's important, and because we move through this work collectively, I'd like to think that we generate some energy when we do it together. So I want us to connect to the land and connect to the energy that's created when we do this type of work together, when we do this type of hard work together. And I also, unfortunately, sort of want to use our land acknowledgement opportunities as a means to talk about consent. And it's a great place to start talking about sexual violence, because when we think about the legacy of colonialism and power imbalances amongst non-Indigenous and Indigenous communities, we can't remove consent from that conversation. And so we're going to look at that a little bit further, or a little bit after that, but I want us to stay connected to that and to move beyond some checklists for land acknowledgements and really share the land and the energy that we're doing the work on. We're going to talk about policy for like this much, because it's boring, but we have to sort of see how we got here. Before we do that, I'm going to throw a lot of stats at you, unfortunately, and none of them are great. But this is why Leah and I have full-time jobs. 1 in 5 women will experience sexual assault at college or university. Yes, men are victims and survivors of sexual violence. Often, sexual violence happens to them before the age of 18. So we do have a focus on supporting young women, and particularly women of marginalized communities, but we also support young men and non-binary folk. 1 in 5. So Bill 132 was passed in 2016, and basically the legislation said, okay, post-secondary schools, you have a problem. Duh, we knew that. And you need to create a policy, a sexual violence policy, to speak to this problem. So this started in Ontario, and now federally all institutions have this policy. But students are asking, and rightly so, so what? Ooh, policy, great, you don't condone sexual violence, yet we're not really seeing any change in the rates of sexual violence. And so we're not really sure that the sexual violence policies do anything. Upstander. So as Leah mentioned, we've been working in collaboration with Fanshawe and other institutions across the province on a bystander intervention program called Upstander. I'm going to go through some of the pieces with you, some of the components and what is different about this program from other sexual violence education and prevention programming. And we're going to try a few things out if time allows, and we'll save a few minutes if anyone has questions and wants to grill me at the end. Okay. Oops. So, what's different? We've received sexual violence prevention programming in our schools probably for some time now. I'd like to think that we move beyond sexual violence education And we include bystander intervention training. So how do we then intervene in a culture, intervene in incidents, intervene in sexual violence when it's safe to do so to help keep our community safe? But then we realized, how are we expecting students and folks to intervene in sexual violence if they don't know what the heck it looks like? What we've been doing for decades, particularly educating young women to say, don't walk alone home at night. Well, actually, most sexual assaults happen indoors. So that's not really keeping our girls safe, is it? We've been educating about stranger danger. Let me tell you, it happens, but this idea that there's like a crazy lunatic with a knife jumping out of bushes and sexually assaulting people, it happens, but it's so few. It's so rare. And so if we're educating, particularly young girls, that's how to keep themselves safe, we're really not keeping them safe. Because we're not actually educating people on how sexual violence is enacted in our everyday and in our communities. So we do that. We like to think about the bystander not in an incident, because again, there's not generally an audience, right? And we like to make sure that we're not contextualizing sexual violence outside of power, privilege, oppression, marginalization. So we go there, and we really go there. We talk about gender and the power imbalances amongst genders. We talk about consent and what it looks like and how historically we've been doing the no means no and the complications with that. We talk about intersectionality. Did you ever talk about intersectionality in our socials? Yeah. Right? My social location dictates not only how susceptible I am to sexual violence, but then whether I will be believed and how I can access supports and resources. So we can't disconnect our identities from sexual violence. And we can't for 1 second believe that there are groups in this world, in our communities, who have less power and therefore, or we have to believe, that they have less power and therefore they are more susceptible to sexual violence. So to be honest, we talk about bystander stuff, but it's like this. We talk about power. And we look at rape culture. We are bystanders in a culture, usually more often than we were bystanders in an actual event of sexual violence. And we talk about perspective, survivor impact, victim impact. Think about, what does it mean actually after something like this has happened to you? What's the trauma-informed perspective to take up? And we do some activities that help students, attach to some sort of compassion to this. Okay. Lastly, right now, and so here's the academic educator, researcher in me, we're doing some robust research attached to this. Because again, we've been doing these one-off workshops, one-off programs, and saying, yep, check the box. We've been telling our students not to sexually assault each other. We're good. But is it working? Maybe, and for how long? Do students need a booster shot, so to speak, 2 years in after they graduate? So we're doing some research to gather some information about the efficacy of the program, the effects of the program, how long they last. And so that when we say we're doing this work and that it actually has impact, we can say that with certainty. Okay, I promise we're going to talk about power and privilege. But first, I just want to talk about bystander effect. Has everybody heard this term before? Thank you. What is it?
Well, if you're aware of, if one person's aware of or witnessing that they will interact with, the more people that are aware of it or witness it, the less likely anybody will intervene.
You got it. So the bystander effect is this social psychology theory that says the more people around, the less likely there is somebody will intervene. And it's true. Now this isn't a time for you to feel like shit about yourselves and be like, oh gosh, I didn't intervene when I saw something happen. It's actually in our nature. And sociologists and psychologists will support that. Anybody recognize this face? Who's it? Yeah, Kitty Genovese. This woman, 50s or 60s, I think, she was a bar manager in New York on her way home from work, so middle of the night. And she was sexually assaulted, stabbed, murdered, in the middle of an apartment complex where there were dozens of people watching, and nobody did anything. And so this actually sparked this discussion about bystander intervention. Why didn't anybody do anything? Like, you can't mistake what's happening as something someone needs help, this is an emergency. But nobody did. So fast forward years later, we're still doing it. We have a name for it now, a rationalization for it, but it's still happening. And so while I do think the bystander intervention programming that we do as it relates to sexual violence is important, I think we're not doing a very good job of educating students about what sexual violence is. Again, for decades we've been saying it's crazy lunatic jumping out of the bushes. That's not actually really how it happens. So we're going to talk about what it looks like so that we can actually intervene. Okay? So the people in Kitty's murder, they were bystanders. They didn't notice it as an emergency. Boggles my mind, but that's what happened. And they couldn't interpret it as an emergency because they kept thinking, well, somebody else is going to do something. Because if it was an emergency, somebody would be doing something. And they don't feel responsible. I'm in my house, because it was a courtyard, and there was like all these apartments kind of looking in. And so they're just watching from their windows, and they're thinking somebody else will do it. It's really not my gig. And maybe even if you kind of said, nope, it's an emergency, I feel responsible, well then what? I mean, certainly we don't want to encourage folks to intervene if it means their safety is at risk, but the people there really didn't know what to do. And of course, I wouldn't feel safe intervening either if someone was being stabbed. And by no means am I suggesting either any of you should be intervening in those. So our hope is that we move towards an upstander sort of framework, where we notice the emergency. Again, this is where we're going to start looking at what does sexual violence look like in our everyday, right? And identify it as such. And then we're feeling motivated. So I'm going to throw some stats at you, some stuff that's going to make you feel uncomfortable, right? I want you to sit in that discomfort, because that's where the learning happens, okay? If you're feeling uncomfortable today, that's a good thing. If you're feeling harmed and you're feeling shut down, that's not where I want to take us, but certainly, as Leah mentioned, she's here for support if you need it. Okay? And then the Upstander program, we go beyond that. We say, okay, so here's some of the skills, here's what to do next. So we do the notice and identify. We provide some motivation through stats and empathy and the skills. Here's some more stats. As I mentioned, yes, of course, men are sexually assaulted. 1 in 6, in fact. I'm not sure about this stat. I don't know how accurate it is. Any idea why I might be a little, I mean, all stats are flawed, but why I might be a little unsure? Thank you.
Men are less likely to report sexual assault.
Yeah. Right? And we're going to take a look at gender and how we've been socialized in certain ways, but men aren't supposed to be sexually assaulted, because men are supposed to want sex all the time, right? So I actually don't know how accurate the stat is, but it's alarming nonetheless. 1 in 5 women while they're in college or university, but 1 in 3 women in their lifetime. 1 in 3. Which boggles my mind because we have a problem with believing survivors. Think about this. If 1 in 3 women are sexually assaulted, like, that's the stat, yet we have such a problem believing people when they come forward. It's just as likely, and I saw this video the other day, it says it rains 1 in 3 days in New York. It's just as likely as rain in New York. We have no problem believing it's raining. We have problems believing folks who come forward with allegations of sexual violence. And that's because rape culture. We'll go there too. 40% of gay men and 47% of bisexual men experience sexual assault in their lifetimes. 44% of lesbians and 61% of bisexual women have been sexually assaulted by an intimate partner. Whoops, too far. These stats to me indicate that we need to not just look at sexual violence, but the people that sexual violence is happening to, right? So what we do is we start looking at gender. Now those folks who were in my class, we just did this, and we had a good look at how we socialize women and girls in this culture, recognizing that we, across cultural contexts, things shift, and how we socialize boys and men in our culture. And so what we did today was we put up we did this. Aw, no. Okay, we did that. We drew a box and I wrote the word man up. And I asked the students, okay, what do we mean when we say man up? What are we telling boys and men to do, right? Throw some balls, be a man, right? All that stuff. And the students started going, be tough, don't be emotional. Bring home the bacon, right? The provider. Have lots of sex, straight sex, not gay sex, right? Be strong and tough. Be the initiator or the aggressor in sex, right? So we did all those things. And then we talked about, okay, well, I know guys that don't perform that social script. What happens to them? And we looked at the very real consequences of stepping outside that gender box. We did the same thing for women. Act like a lady, right? Be polite, be quiet, be passive. Have sex, but you have to be married. Be thin, not too thin. Be sexy, not too sexy. Be a mom. So these are sort of some of the lists. There's some offensive words on here, and we found that that's important. What are the words that we're seeing in our communities? So this is sort of the list of how to man up. This is the list on how to act like a lady. These are the repercussions or the consequences of not doing those things. Not following the social scripts. Homophobic language, misogynistic language, and violence. So when we look at those, we think, well, God, why would anybody step outside the box? Why on earth would anybody not do those things, knowing that these are the consequences? So when we look at the two boxes, again, we're looking at gender in a very binaristic way at this point. Okay? When we look at these boxes, we see a very clear power imbalance. And if we look at very specific things, like sex is always on their mind, down for sex anytime, anywhere, straight as hell, and we look at women, orgasms are nice, but not expected, sexually submissive, virginal, you can see why we might have a bit of a problem. If we're socializing boys and men to be one way, and girls and women basically to be the opposite, we have a big problem. And so if we can't start to dissect gender in the way we've been socialized, we can't begin to start thinking about how to prevent sexual violence. So before we even get there, we start with this. Questions? So it matters. Our gender matters. It informs how we engage with others, including sexually. And so our gender roles contribute to sexual violence. The expectations, the scripts put on us as boys, girls, as soon as we're born. And that's what I said in my class today. You were literally born into this world, and the first thing, it's a boy, it's a girl. And from that moment, you are socialized in very specific ways. And the consequences of not following that script are disgusting and dangerous. And we're particularly asking young folks then, right? To step outside the box, be yourself, be authentic, don't conform to these misogynistic and homophobic ideals. But we're not actually giving them any agency to do that because we still put the repercussions of stepping outside those boxes upon them. So the Upstander program, I think, spends a great deal of time talking about gender and actually dismantling it. It's a social construction for those social students in the room. It's not a real thing. It's something we do. It's something we perform. Okay. So we move on from gender to talk about social location. Because if there's one thing I want you to take away from today, please know sexual violence is not about sex or pleasure or desire. It's about power and control. So when we talk about intersectionality in our social location, we have to then connect to the work, right? If I'm a member of a community that's marginalized or oppressed in our society, I am therefore more likely to be sexually assaulted in my lifetime, less likely to be believed when I do come forward, and have less supports and services available to me. Or less supports and services available to me that actually support my needs. Here's some stats to bring that home. 83% of women with disabilities will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime. 83%. 8 out of 10. So again, you can't look at these stats and say, maybe it's not about sex, right? Look, of course, it's about power. We're looking at groups who have been marginalized in our society, and we're seeing disproportionate representation of sexual violence. 20% of trans folk in Ontario have been targets of physical and sexual assault because of their gender identity. So the other thing that Upstander does is we seek to expand everybody's understanding of what sexual violence looks like, not just from the way sexual assault occurs, but if you're a target because of your gender expression or identity, that's considered sexual violence. We're going to go there. We're going to talk about that. 34% of trans folk have been verbally threatened or harassed. 75% of Indigenous girls in Canada under the age of 18 have been sexually assaulted. 75%. Again, like I mentioned at the beginning, if we're thinking about the legacy that we have in this country of colonialism and oppression of our Indigenous communities, and we look at the statistic, and what more is that what we know is that if you've been sexually abused as a child, you are more likely to be a victim of sexual assault as an adult. So we have this number, 57% of Indigenous women in Canada have been sexually abused. Again, we can't disconnect this from the power imbalance we have in our community. When colonial settlers came to Canada, they viewed Indigenous women in very specific ways. I hate to use the term, but we'll call it what it is. They use the term squaw, right? That Indigenous women are inherently sexually available. And it's this idea that started then and has been carried through today, and we see a big problem in our Indigenous communities, I should say. And why we have such a big problem with murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in Canada. So I use these stats, yes, to unsettle you, but to really connect you to the fact that sexual violence isn't about sex. It's about power. And my hope is that these stats, again, unsettle you, but also connect that for you. Okay, so what am I talking about? I talked about policy. I said I'd only talk about it for a little bit, but I'm back. We, in our policies, use jargon to help us understand what sexual violence is. Sexual abuse, assault or rape, sexual harassment, stalking, indecent exposure, degrading imagery, voyeurism, cyber harassment, trafficking, and exploitation. That's sort of when you're... Who here has read the policy on sexual violence at Fanshawe? Thank you, Leah. I should hope so. Okay. None of us. And if you did, you're going to see a lot of this language, which is fine. We have to call it something. But our argument is that that's not what you folks are talking about. This isn't the language you're using in your everyday at the dinner table, or if your bar scene is your thing, you're sitting there having drinks. Right? You're not talking about it this way. So what does it look like in your world, perhaps? Here's some ideas. So joking about violence. I get folks saying, "Oh, come on, Danielle, it's just a joke, no big deal, we're just lighthearted, get off your high horse." I don't get invited to parties anymore. That's not funny. But it's not funny, because what you're doing, if there's a survivor around you, you're basically telling that person what happened to them is funny, it's not a big deal, it's laughable. Similarly, and arguably in some ways even worse, if there's a perpetrator or a would-be perpetrator of sexual violence near you, you're saying to them, go for it. Do it. Or, I'm glad you did, it was funny. So we're normalizing and making permissible sexual violence through jokes. And so it's not okay. We're creating a foundation of sexual violence that makes other forms of sexual violence permissible and normalized. Sharing intimate photos. Okay, other thing I want to be really clear about, Upstander is sex positive, if that's your thing, okay? If you and your partner want to take sexy pictures and videos and share them and that's your thing, awesome, do it. Could be fun. The minute that gets shared with somebody else without their consent, not only is it sexual violence, it's actually against the law, okay? So do your thing, I assure you, okay? But with consent. And revenge porn. Have everybody heard this term, revenge porn? Yeah, gross. Anybody know what it is? You're like, yes. Go ahead.
It's like videotaping you and your partner and then sharing it, but without them knowing that the videotaping is actually happening. Usually in revenge.
For revenge. Yeah, I mean, it is what, yeah. Self-explanatory, I suppose. So, let's say you do, right? You're taking those sexy videos and yeah, everyone's game, right? You break up or there's a fight or something. There's actually sites that you can, I'm not advocating by any means, I'm not telling you where they are, but there's sites that you can upload these videos and pictures to humiliate your partner and seek revenge. Purposely misgendering somebody, we get it wrong sometimes. It's okay. We're all learning. But if someone corrects you, their gender pronoun, and you ignore it, and you continue to misgender them, it's sexual violence. Objectification in advertising, getting someone drunk to hook up. GHB and roofies are not the #1 date rape drug, it's alcohol. Threatening to force sexual acts. This is coercion, right? So again, when we think about sexual violence, the Upstander program is looking at expanding what sexual violence looks like and how it exists in our world. So I don't want us just to think about the do it or else, right? Do it or else I'll do it with someone else. Do it or else, I'll break up with you. Do it or else you're probably not going to be that popular, right? Now I do want to take this moment to honor the fact that we make difficult decisions about our bodies every day. Particularly young people in post-secondary education who are coming into a new environment and they want to fit in. They want to be a part of, you know, the social scene. They want to be liked. They want their new partner to want them and to love them. And so we make difficult decisions about our bodies every day, and I'm not shaming anybody for doing those things. But we have to understand that it's not as easy as, you know, like I said, person jumping out of the bushes, right? It's the social pressures on conforming that can actually lead to sexual violence. Street harassment. Oh, so I'm a new mom, a new 8-month-old, and we were walking to Tim Hortons, and something really messed up happened. I'm pushing a stroller, and a car full of men drive by, and I hear, MILF! Does everybody know what that means? Thank God. I'm going to get fired saying the F word. And I was like, oh my God. Well, you know, maybe this isn't the first time I've been sexually harassed. It won't be my last. And I looked down at my daughter and I thought, God damn, that was the first time for her. And it won't be her last. And then something really screwed up happened. I smiled. I smiled. One, because I didn't know what to do. I was like, ugh, right? If I scream at them, I could be susceptible to violence, retaliation. So I didn't say anything. I didn't intervene. And heck, like, I do this shit for a living. I teach people on how to intervene in sexual assault and violence. And then I realized I also smiled because it made me feel good. Because I just had a baby. All right, I still got it, right? And it got me thinking about the way we've been socialized, right? It was such a moment for me to think, God, I actually been socialized as a young woman to want that attention, even though my, you know, decade of education and training tells me that's wrong and it's disgusting. It's still sort of like, okay. Such a messed up place. But I also share this story because I want us to not create a hierarchy of sexual violence. That like, oh, it was just street harassment. Because look what that actually did to me. It had an impact on my daughter. She doesn't even know it yet. And it had an impact on the way I was feeling about myself. And I felt icky about smiling. I felt icky that I didn't say anything. I didn't sort of model that upstander behavior for my daughter. But I also felt icky because I felt good. Ugh. Anyway, so I just want us to be clear that one form of sexual violence isn't worse than the other because we have no idea, right, how each person's biography changes how we respond to, interact with forms of sexual violence. Yeah?
But shouldn't it be kind of like a group? Obviously, like if someone being enrolled is not the same as...
That's not for us to decide. I guess that would be what I would say about that. So let's say, for example, someone's street harassment in the past did lead to a sexual assault. So street harassment is actually a really triggering experience for them. I just don't think, because we all have our own life trajectories, our own biographies, our own social locations, I can't for 1 second say how we should respond or what is serious or not serious because it didn't happen to me. It's not for me to decide whether it was a big deal or not. That's for you to decide if it happens to you. Not stopping sex when your partner changes their mind. We're going to talk about consent and how it needs to be continuous. This is a big one. You could be whispering sweet nothings, it seems here all night about all the things you want to do to them later. And then you get to their house and you start doing all those things. And you change your mind, it's done. If it continues, after you've said you're done, sexual violence. Online and cyber harassment. Slapping someone's butt. I know that sounds really stupid, of course it's sexual violence. But I include this one because it's interesting to think about context and environment where sexual violence happens. It's important here. Okay. I'm working with CAMH, Center of Addiction and Mental Health, on a research project that looks at sexual aggression, alcohol, and men, particularly as it relates to bar culture. And they had a focus group of boys, men, sorry, and they asked them, all right, give it to me. What are some of the common things that happen in the bar scene? You know, like what goes on? And I said, yeah, some people go up to somebody, you don't know, and you start grinding on them. I don't know if this is how they do it, but let's pretend this is what it looks like. I'll offend all of you. Yeah, that's something. Or, someone walks by and they're like, looking someone up and down. Or, ooh, I like the way your legs look in that dress, or the way you look in that pantsuit. Or, someone walks by and they get a little tap on skis or whatever it is they do. And they said, yeah, that's pretty normal behavior at the bar. Makes sense. And they said, and then the researcher said, okay, what if you did those things at the bus stop? And the guys were like, oh, that's a sexual assault. So it's okay here, but not okay here. So the other thing that we're trying to do with Upstander is say, actually, it's not okay anywhere. But for some reason, there are certain spaces, environments, cultural contexts where it's actually okay, normalized, expected. There's a lot of girls here today, and I'm going to assume that those who are interested in the bar scene make plans with their girlfriends about keeping each other safe at the bars. Right? If someone keeps bothering you, continuing to flirt after you've said no, we kind of do the, come to the bathroom with me. Right? But it's sort of screwed up because we've actually socialized boys and men to continue to try. There's nothing wrong with training boys. I have beautiful men in my life. We have an issue with hyper-toxic masculinity that tells boys to keep doing that, right? And tell girls to just sort of passively, say, don't be too confrontational. So we also learned that there could be violence as a repercussion for being too, to object too loudly. So it matters where we are? No, No. So we want to say, you know, if you can't do something at a bus stop, you can't do it in a bar, damn it. Okay? But yeah, I remember back in the day, like me and my girlfriends, we'd get geared up. But we also wanted to look sexy. We wanted to have that attention because we've been socialized to want that attention, right? It's confusing. It gets messy, right? Trying to get your partner in the mood when they said no, this one gets a lot of friction. That's because it happens all the time. I also want to mention that when I do some of these talks and I start contextualizing sexual violence in this way, people will often be in the audience going, oh, shit. I've either perpetrated sexual violence or I've been subjected to it and I never really thought about it in that way. I'm not here to label your experiences, okay? I'm not here to shame anybody for anything they've done, okay, or anything that's happened to them. But again, we can't intervene if we don't know what we're looking for. So trying to get your partner in the mood, it goes something like this. Partner initiates sex. Hey, come on, baby. Something like that. And partner says, no, really, you're not in the mood. Oh, no, come on, it'll be fine. You know, it's been so long. No, I got a headache. Ah, this will make your headache go away. You laugh because you know. No, really, maybe later. No, come on now. Before the kids get home, before the game is on, whatever. And you say, okay, fine. Consent. You've said yes. They've said yes. No. Because what's happened is consent has been given after you've been worn down. They're like continuous, like, come on, fine. You're like, fine, let's do it. If I had said yes 5 minutes ago, we'd be done by now. But this is what we're talking about. It's not that like, do it or else. Sometimes it seems gentle, subtle. Right? I don't know, if I were you, I want to have sex with somebody when they're like, yeah, right away. And they're sober, but we'll get there. Right? Not because I've been like giving them every excuse under the sun as to why we should do it now. That doesn't sound sexy to me. Okay, and conversion rate. Anybody know what that is? Primarily, gay, lesbian, queer women are subjected to conversion rape. It's a form of rape in an attempt to convert them to heterosexuality. So again, I think, and like, hey, this is not an exhaustive list, but it might give us a little bit more insight as to what sexual violence looks like outside of this. Who uses the term voyeurism in their conversations? Who knows what voyeurism is? Do you want to share? You don't have to.
It's like when you're kind of like keeping calm type behavior.
Right? Watching somebody do something private without their consent. Again, we're sex positive. If you say to your partner, hey, I'm going to stand in front of my window and undress at 8 p.m., you be there. If that's your thing, go for it. With consent. Consent. But we don't talk about it like voyeurism, right? Keeping calm. I don't love the term, but that's how we know it. So let's use the language that people are using. Okay? We can't intervene if we don't know what we're looking for. So, sexual violence refers to any form of sexual contact without consent. This includes, as I mentioned, the targeting of sexuality, gender expression, or identity, whether physiological or psychological. Okay? Kissing, fondling, sexual intercourse, vaginal or anal, oral sex, are all amazing, if that's your thing. But only when there's consent. Okay? We're celebrating the sex we want to have as a means to end the sex we don't want to have. So what is consent? What's the stat, Leah? 1 in 3 Canadians can't identify what consent is? Ugh. It's never assumed or implied. I use the example of my marriage. My partner, if only they were here today. My marriage certificate is not a contract for open access to my naked body for the rest of my life. That is not what that gives. So even in a marriage or a relationship, there's still no implying of consent. It needs to be negotiated. Sure, my partner and I, much better at negotiating those conversations now. It's a little less clunky. But it still has to happen. It's not the silence or the absence of no. We used to, as you recall, educate particularly young girls, no means no. That's not the case. It has to be a yes. It has to be enthusiastic, sober, right? It can't be given if someone is incapacitated by drugs or alcohol. We actually have to tell folks that if someone's passed out, they can't consent. I'll say it. I can't believe I have to say it, but we have to say it. Can't be obtained through threats or coercion. Again, whether it's, a physical threat or that sort of subtle, and again, I don't want to call it gentle, but more gentle coercion. Can be revoked at any time, so it has to be continuous. And it can be obtained if the perpetrator abuses a position of trust, power, or authority. A boss, a teacher, a supervisor. If somebody has your livelihood, your funding, your grades, your future in their hands, you cannot consent to sexual behavior with them. Because there's a power imbalance. Now this is the point where a lot of students say to me, oh, girl, you are a buzzkill. This is a mood killer. What are you suggesting, right? Like, I pull out this contract and say, hey, I'd like to do the following things to your body. Sign here if you agree. And then we reconvene after first base and then second base. That is not what I'm suggesting. Here's what I am suggesting. Make consent your foreplay. If sex is your thing, tell me if this might be hot. Let's have a conversation about the things we want to do to each other's bodies. How, when, where, what might feel good. I can tell you what might feel good for me. You tell me what might feel good for you. That's hot. That's a consent conversation. Everyone's on the same page. Now it can still change as things move on. But to me, consent can be sexy. It can be this part of foreplay that you have a conversation about what you want to do. It doesn't have to be this weird contract or clunky conversation. And I will say, if you are not comfortable having a conversation about the things you want to do to somebody's body, you're not ready to do them. Questions? It's complicated, yes.
I have a question about the alcohol. It's usually people have sex with drugs, right?
It's okay, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So consent isn't as black and white as we would hope. For many reasons. One, we communicate differently, right? As humans, we're not always saying yes, 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 right? We have nonverbal communication, we have indirect communication, Netflix and chill, again, I'm not saying that's consent, but I'm saying we have different conversations. It's complicated by alcohol. What I will say is this. Two people are drunk, the person who initiates sex is the aggressor. And the person who does not initiate sex cannot provide consent. Which is problematic because what have we been doing? Socializing our boys to initiate sex. I get it. It's complicated. But it's not miscommunication. I don't buy for 1 second that I misunderstood. There's been study after study that shows we actually can read people when they're in a bad mood, if they don't want to go for dinner, they don't want to go to the hockey game. But for some reason, we can't pick up those social cues when it comes to sexual behavior and interaction. So I don't buy it for a second. Okay? So the other thing that we look at Upstander is around belief and the impacts of sexual violence on survivors. And we look at responding to a disclosure. That comma shouldn't be there. We do this because despite our best efforts, the statistics are not changing. Sexual assault and sexual violence is just as prevalent as it was 50 years ago. So while we're working on that stuff, we can also work on creating a culture and a community where we support one another and we believe each other and we know how to respond if someone does come forward with an allegation and they tell us what happened to them. I want to be clear too, how many people here are in like social service, social or human foundations, human services type stuff? Okay. Chances are, in your careers, you will receive a disclosure of some kind. Lee and I are working on this. Of course. But we need to be clear that not everyone's disclosing for the same reasons. So we can't make assumptions as to why they're telling us. Maybe they just want some support, justice, and we can't even be prescriptive about what justice looks like. They need some support with academics, and Leah also helps with that here on campus. They want to raise awareness, whatever the case may be. So we want to hold space that people sometimes are just coming to because it's sitting inside them and they need to tell somebody, right? What you'll see here is a few different potential responses to a disclosure. Some of them are lovely. Some of them are not. Some of them could work, some of them, depending. Is there any one on here that you really like? Like someone came to you, disclosed sexual violence, and you're like, I would say this. Yeah. I believe you. Particularly now, we're seeing this culture where we don't believe folks. And you don't have to say the words, I believe you, because they'll be like, oh, crap, I didn't think you didn't, and now I'm not so sure. But you can convey the message of belief, right? Or, no one's going to believe me, she's the president of the student council. I believe you. That can be really powerful. Thank you. Another one we like? Yes.
Thank you for telling me.
Thank you for telling me. Also a good one. Why? Survivors and victims think they're going to burden you with this information. They're going to think, oh, if I tell you, now you're sucked into my drama, my world. Right? So you can say, thanks for telling me. It's basically saying it's okay. Okay. They're telling me to shut up. Yes?
It's going to be okay because although in the moment it may seem like it's a very strong experience, in the end, eventually once you work through your struggles, you could potentially be okay.
It's going to be okay? I don't love that one. It might work for some. I don't love it's going to be okay because it might not be okay. And that's okay. Right? We're going to move on. Let's do one that we hate. Thank you.
You need to be careful about this if the room is like.
Oh God, we don't need to unpack that one, I hope. It doesn't matter. I want to just look at one. You got laid, why are you complaining? Or, where's the other one? Oh, you got laid. Who's probably giving the disclosure? Friend? What kind of, a male. Again, we have these myths and barriers to receiving disclosures because we've been told sexual violence doesn't happen to men. We need to dismantle some of these myths. If you don't report it, it probably didn't happen because if it did, you would have reported it. If it was that big of a deal, you would have reported it. No, because we know what happens. Men can be sexually assaulted. Sexual assault happens by strangers or certain type of creepy people. No, it happens by people we know. Friends, family, neighbors, person sitting next to you in class. Happens all the time. So as long as we're telling people it's the creep over there, it's that certain type of person, it's a stranger, we're not actually protecting each other. Women lie about rape. No! Why would you? Look what happens. Kavanaugh cases bodies that. Not to mention, let me give you one last stat for the day. False allegations, they do happen. The same rate as any other crime, about 3-4%. they happen, but any other crime similarly. Okay, so we're going to believe, provide safe place, ask if they want to call someone. Don't ask questions or details. Don't ask someone to recount their trauma. We, for some reason, have this like morbid obsession of wanting to know the details, and I get that. But just don't. You're going to re-traumatize them, and actually, if they go forward to the police, you're now a witness. And again, I'll end by reminding you that sexual violence is about power. When someone is sexually assaulted, the power has been taken away from them. So what we need to do when they give us a disclosure is make sure they are in the driver's seat of what happens next. Full stop. So we don't make decisions for them. Oh, you should report this. You should. Don't do you should anything. Okay? They are in control of what happens next. As mentioned, Leah Marshall is Fanshawe Sexual Violence Prevention Advisor. Contact. Campus security. Please read this carefully. And of course, if you need support, whether it's historical or a recent incident, Counseling Accessibility Services can provide support as well. These are community supports. I've got some pamphlets here for Leah and for some of our community supports. Help yourselves, for you or for people in your life. And that's it.